Music. It's the love of music that brings us together. The love of music that forms the bond between us. For the next hour, join us for the love of music, presenting those aspects of music which excite, provoke, and inspire. Our host today is David Dubal, WNCN music director, pianist, educator, and writer on music. Here is David Dubal for the love of music.
And this is David Dubal, and today my guest is one of the most celebrated of this planet's pianists. His name is Earl Wild, and I congratulate Mr. Wild because this very young man is now in his 65th birthday this month, I think.
That's correct, David.
Earl Wild, happy birthday,
Thank
and
you.
welcome to WNCN.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
You've had quite a career, and if I may say so, this is a career that has had a great cumulative effect because you were born in 1915.
15, yes.
Now, this was not a especially great time for an American pianist to emerge because everyone was in America, dollar land, so to speak. All of the great Slavic stars and a Bauhaus was coming, and he couldn't make it because he wasn't flashy enough, perhaps, or it was too austere. And everyone had to have a European reputation. And
Well, that's very true. You also should remember that at that time, we weren't so concerned about the European thing because, for instance, in Pittsburgh, where I was born, it was totally European. We had people from every country, Hungarians, Poles, Italians. Everyone was there, and it was very interesting. Of course, there were many WASPs, of which I was raised in a WASP family. But fortunately, because of music, I was able to associate with everyone and had a marvelous time as a child because of that.
You don't think, though, later on that not being born in Europe and having a European reputation didn't hurt?
It helped in those days if you came from Europe.
Yes.
It still helps.
Yes.
But little by little, we're getting over it. It's like, for instance, if I go to South America, my name is most unusual down there. Therefore, I'm an oddity, and the public is much more receptive to me than in the United States, although I've had big success in England.
In America, your name should have been Wildowski or something.
Yes, well, when you're an oddity, you are always more accepted. You know, it's like an antique, more or less, which I'm becoming. Yes.
Not true. Earl Wild is a pianist of such virtuosity. You were just saying antique. Do you feel that this virtuosity is dwindling?
Oh, no, not at all. The fact is, it's more focused than ever. But getting back to the Pittsburgh days again, when I was a child, it was very interesting because I heard, at a very young age, De Pachmann, and I heard Paderewski when he played rather well, and I had an impression of many of the artists, and I heard the famous son-in-law of Mark Twain, Gabrilowitsch, and I read so many things later on in my life about these pianists, written by people who never really heard them, and I was shocked at what I heard because, for instance, Gabrilowitsch, in my book, was a very dull pianist. I heard him play 2 Brahms concerti one time, and it was a mezzo forte from beginning to end, and a little on the slow side, very careful, and totally uninspired.
Oh, interesting.
And so today when I read books about these people and read these marvelous reports, it's so amusing. And it's almost like reading the books on Toscanini, because I played the keyboard instruments in the orchestra for 8 years at NBC under Toscanini, and I read all of these books written by people who used to have to hide in the auditorium. They lie on the floor during the rehearsals, you know, so that the old men wouldn't see them. And they write books about him, and they were never close, and they have this great deification all of the time, and so much of it is absolutely nonsense, rubbish, as the English say.
Well, so much of writing on music is rubbish,
yes,
including much criticism.
Yes, exactly.
You being born in 1915 in Pittsburgh, then you were a real Depression child in a sense. You had to go out and earn a living early.
Oh, yes.
That's how you got to NBC, probably.
There was no money in 1928. Everything went, you know, and in the 30s, it was a desperate time for most people, the early 30s.
So you surely didn't win some glamorous contest, and then...
Well, there were no contests then, thank God. We had to work in music as a profession, which was marvelous, because I learned how to orchestrate before I was 15. I mean, I could do an orchestration for you, and that was one of the reasons that I became a member of the NBC staff in New York, which was a much sought-after position at that time.
Really? And you were there about 8 years?
Oh, I stayed at NBC for 8 years, and then when the Red and the Blue Network split, I went to the American Broadcasting Company and stayed there for many years.
Was the high point of your stay at NBC when you were soloist in the Rhapsody in Blue with Toscanini?
Well, not particularly. It was just another concert as far as that was concerned.
But that was the
I
first
very,
for both of you.
Yes, I was very pleased that he asked me because I was one of his great admirers and still am.
Now, you know Gershwin has been associated with you, and you have adored him as a composer-transcriber.
Well, the thing about the Toscanini invitation to play the Rhapsody in Blue was that I didn't know the piece at the time, and I learned it for that performance, and then the day after the performance, I was the great authority.
Yes. You became almost a specialist in
right.
two works.
It was very amusing. I used to laugh about it, but then I played the concerto, and I liked the concerto very much, and I used to play the concerto when people would look down upon it as a piece of cheap music.
Yes.
Now it's accepted everywhere, and they play it in Russia a lot.
Absolutely.
And, it's interesting how times have changed. Of course, when I was in Pittsburgh also, there was a wave, an anti-Tchaikovsky wave at that time, in the late 30s, where Tchaikovsky was looked upon as a cheap composer. Can you imagine?
No, I can't imagine. I don't trust anyone that doesn't like Tchaikovsky,
Of course
frankly.
not. No.
Earl Wild, we have today, and you yourself have programmed it from your tremendous discography. We have a very specialized program, and it's based on the transcription. We'll have three, and we'll have other composers, and we'll have, of course, a very famous piece, the waltz that started the whole thing going, the Invitation to the Dance by Weber in Tausig's version. And I want to begin by having our audience listen to a composer by the name of Schütt.
That's
And
correct.
you have a transcription of Die Fledermaus. Tell me about this man and this piece.
Well, Schütt was born in Russia, I think in around 1850. He died in 1933, which is, rather recent for anybody my age. We consider that to be recent. So therefore, he lived during the time of all of the great Romantic composers. Yes. He died a little after Chopin, so he didn't hear Chopin, but certainly he knew Liszt and Brahms and all of that school. His music it's not great, but it has the one ingredient which was so wonderful of that period: great charm.
Yes,
and it's very much like the Chrysler transcriptions. This piece, it's fragmentary, but it's very, very pretty. I like that. I will play pieces of music if they have one or two good things in them. I don't always look for masterpieces.
Yes, and this, of course, is, in my opinion, one of your great importances besides being a great artist. You have helped, very much so, I may say, in extending the literature of the piano in our time. Let's hear Earl Wild in the Die Fledermaus transcription by Eduard Schütt. And that was the great American-born virtuoso pianist Earl Wild playing with the same love he'd played with the Fauré Ballade in a Fledermaus transcription by Schütt. And after this message, we'll be back with my guest, Earl Wild, who we are celebrating this month, his 65th birthday, and next week we will also have a program. This program will be on transcriptions only. Earl Wild is my guest. Mr. Wild, how did you come to the world of transcription, which is a whole literature in itself that pianists have neglected?
Well, when I studied in Pittsburgh with a man named Selmar Janssen was the man who brought all of these things to light to me. He had a collection of this music. He had studied with Teresa Carreño, and also one of her husbands, Eugene Dalbert, and Shavenka.
Mm-hmm.
So he had all of these arrangements and things because they were in vogue in when he was a student.
Mm-hmm.
And so he had collected them all. So he used to show them to me, and every once in a while suggest I learn one. So I learned many transcriptions. And it was marvelous because there were always technical problems in them. They were made as display pieces, and it was certainly better than playing exercises.
Absolutely.
So that you could apply what you would learn from these things to the more serious music which you would perform.
It's a very good idea to use this instead of some dry Czerny etude, let's say. But of course, Czerny wrote some interesting things. But for many years, it was out of fashion to play them. At Juilliard, where you teach, do you give students any of these, or do they think this is a fluff that they shouldn't waste their time on?
Every once in a while I play one of them for my students, and then they always ask for the music. And I notice that lately there's been quite a revival among the students, their interest in this sort of thing. It's historical and it's amusing. It's the decoration of the period, and it's so wonderful.
Yes, and it's the piano. I mean, these
Yes.
composers knew the instrument so well. It's a total delight for the hands to work on these things, isn't it so?
Oh, they're remarkable for that reason.
Now, how do they go over for audiences?
Audiences love them.
Yes, of course
Yes.
they would, and
They always did.
They've been deprived of
Yes.
them.
Take Mr. Horowitz, for instance, when he plays one of his transcriptions at a recital, that's the talk of the concert for the next months.
Absolutely. It's interesting. You have been a transcriber, and you have transcribed, other than Gershwin, which are rather known. You play them, and you have a recording. But I didn't know that you transcribed Tchaikovsky.
Oh yes, I have also transcriptions from Buxtehude on. I have a whole box full of them.
It's not really well known that you're a composer from not only the world of transcription, but up to oratorio and ballet.
Well, again, it goes back to my childhood. There was no money, and we all had to learn to make a living. And so we did anything in music that could supply us with the necessary things for food and for living in general.
Let's hear the Tchaikovsky-Wild transcription. When did this come about?
About 2 or 3 years ago. I always have enjoyed Swan Lake. I don't enjoy it as much now as I used to, but I still love some of the tunes.
Oh, yeah.
And so I always wanted to make a transcription of the Danse of the Cygnes, the Four Swans, the pas de quatre, because I thought it would be amusing on the piano. So that was my first one of Tchaikovsky.
And now we will hear Earl Wild play from Swan Lake. In the great tradition of the greatest transcribers, Earl Wild has played his own, the pas de quatre from the Swan Lake of Tchaikovsky. How, Earl, do you get this glassy sound that is just so full of yet, sheen? I've never been able to understand it. It's a characteristic of your sound.
I'm a very close player. I only lift my hands off the piano to relax the muscles of the arms. And I was taught that by Egon Petri when I was quite young. And then it was followed up by a man in Boston named Paul Doguereau, who was a pupil of Ravel. And it was those two people who really influenced that type of playing. You never lose contact with the keys, and if you think one note louder than the other, you can do it immediately.
It's interesting. With the sound, you'd think that you would be using lots of movement, and yet you're not, huh?
Well, you see, before the key sounds, when depressed, there's quite a bit of space. So by keeping your hands right on top of the ivories, you have better contact.
Now, did Petri perhaps learn this from Busoni, who he studied with?
Yes, and Petri also played the organ very well.
Yes, he did. He played the violin. He was an amazing musician, wasn't he? So he was a great influence on your. Well, he was a transcription man too.
Oh yes, he was absolutely wonderful. He could do incredible things on the spur of the moment.
Now, who is, for the audience that does not know, because two transcriptions of his are on this program of yours, Earl Wild transcription program. Who is Tausig?
Tausig was one of Liszt's pupils. He died at the age of 30. It was the most unfortunate thing. But during his short life, he made many, many marvelous transcriptions, and Liszt felt that he was his greatest pupil.
Yes. He still lives in piano mythology. It's amazing. He no recordings, and yet Tausig is always around somewhere.
Yes, wonderful.
Of course, his exercises have survived, too. How is the Marche Militaire?
The Marche Militaire is absolutely wonderful. It's a very difficult piece from the standpoint of stamina, because it never stops from the beginning to the end, and it's not a short transcription.
It's 5 minutes and 13 seconds, and we will hear Earl Wild in the Schubert-Tausig Marche Militaire. Bravo. Earl Wild in the Marche Militaire, Schubert-Tausig. And you're smiling a bit, as you deserve to. That was a strain to play, but what rewards, because this is a man who understood the instrument.
Oh, yes, and not only that, he maintains the spirit of the piece, and has great charm. In transcriptions, if they're charming or if they're dramatic or brilliant, that's enough.
Yeah. Well, we're going to go back now to one of your transcriptions. It's Lady Be Good, Gershwin-Wild. Did you know Gershwin at all?
I met him when I was very young, several times, but I really didn't know him.
No, he died too early. Yeah. I'm sure he'd be pleased to hear these, and these melodies are excellent. You have a definite flair for his music. You have a whole recording.
Well, I was raised, during that period, and I heard everyone play, including, of course, the famous Art Tatum. Incidentally, in the Lady Be Good, I've always thought that the piece was played too fast for what it really meant. So my transcription of it puts it into a 12/8 blues feeling, and it's like a fat person who's very sexy walking down the street, who's a fat lady. And, when fat people move, they're always very graceful because they can't make any sharp points. Everything has to go in circles and curves. Fabulous. And so I tried to get that into this arrangement because I thought it would be amusing.
This is truly programmatic besides the words. Lady Be Good in Earl Wild's piano transcription. Lady Be Good in the transcription by Earl Wild, my guest today. And after this message, we will be back with more conversation with Mr. Wild. We are back, and you certainly have rhythm, and that's going to be the next transcription. Do you practice with the metronome ever? How? Because, you have a tremendous, no matter how much rubato, you always have a definite rhythm. It's always to be heard.
Well, I find that in most, of the music that we hear, we the basic thing really is always the rhythm, and if there is a give, it can be in the rhythm, and it makes for much easier listening, because after all, you are transported from one place to the other by music. What happens during that is something else. Mm-hmm. But the actual way of doing it is rhythmically. So I always try to make that one of the essential underlying things. And actually, you can't practice and get a natural rhythm with the metronome. I always feel unnerved when I'm playing something and the rhythm isn't good. Mm-hmm. So I turn on a little tape machine and I listen, and I try to find out where it is that my nervous system is overtaking me. Mm-hmm. Because I hear it when I teach. In my pupils, I see it all the time, and I'm constantly after them to get control of that, because then you can do marvelous things with the tone. And I prefer now that I'm older, I prefer doing things with sound rather than with distorting the rhythms. I used to distort the rhythms much more, but now I prefer having more variation in sound.
As a teacher, do you find that rhythm is one of the chief problems students have?
Oh, yes, because, you see, when you're young, your nervous system is so active and you're so hyper. The music is so intense, that they have tendency to move forward too much, or in the serious places to overdo it by holding back. Mm-hmm. Right now, at our present state in music, there seems to be the impression that if you go very, very slowly, it has to be profound.
Now, we have one more transcription from, I think this is your Quintessence album.
Yes.
Of all Earl Wild transcriptions.
Yes.
Including that big Grand Fantasy.
Of the Gershwin pieces, yes.
Yes. I think everyone should own this record because it is a tremendous example of, I think Earl Wild is certainly the equal of Gershwin in this album.
I recorded the Fantasy before I played it in public, and after I played it in public, I decided it was too long. Yes. I think it runs around 28 minutes, so I made a cut in it for the public performance, and it's much more interesting. But I'm glad I did have the whole thing on the record, because records are a little bit different than public performance.
They are. We have now not 28 minutes of Gershwin, but 1 minute 25 seconds in Earl Wild's transcription of I Got Rhythm. That was an absolutely divine transcription of I Got Rhythm by Earl Wild, my guest today and next week on this program, and we will be right back with Mr. Wild in more conversation about the piano literature himself and whatever else comes to his very brilliant mind. This is David Dubal and Earl Wild. We're going to listen to a transcription. Indeed, it's an interesting work because the Invitation to the Dance by Weber was for solo piano, and then it became well known because Berlioz transcribed it for the first performance in Paris, I believe, of their Freischütz as a ballet. So people are never quite certain what kind of work it is, but it really was a piano piece.
I love the original.
Yes.
I think the original is marvelous.
But why did every pianist of the 19th century want to dabble with this work?
You know, it's fashionable. You know, it's like fashion. You want to dress up. And so when they get a simple piece like this, somebody comes along and says, oh, why didn't he do this? Or why didn't he do that? And so I think it's fun to hear what people... It's like imagining yourself in a different role, I think. Because the original is so charming and so beautiful. After all, Greta Garbo played it in Camille in the movie.
Yes. In fact, everyone had to play the Invitation to the Dance throughout the 19th century.
That's right. It was the piece.
And
they made the ballet out of it, the Spectre de la Rose. And
yes.
But I love the transcription just as much as I like the original. And I think this is the best of the transcriptions of it. I find the Godowsky one marvelous, but it is too busy. Mm-hmm. And like many of the Godowsky transcriptions, and I've played quite a few of them, I find that one is never able to have the abandon in them that you can have in the technical spots.
Yes.
that you can have in the Tausig pieces.
I must say that your performance of Wine, Women, and Song, right?
Oh, yes.
Is one of the great examples of Godowsky playing.
The trouble with the Godowsky pieces is that they're so difficult that if you program them, that's the last thing you think of before you go onto the stage.
Yeah.
And it occupies your mind while you're on the way to the hall.
No audience really can ever quite, unless they're an audience totally of pianists who have studied the stuff, ever realize the difficulty.
Yes, that's true. Yes.
So in a sense, they're ungrateful. And the Tausig, indeed, is not ungrateful.
It's a wonderful piece,
Yes.
yes.
Let us hear Earl Wild in a performance that we've never heard on this station at all of the Invitation to the Dance, Weber-Tausig. And that was the great pianist Earl Wild in a wonderful performance of the Weber-Tausig Invitation to the Dance. Mr. Wild will return next week when we will have not a transcription program, but the regular repertory. Mr. Wild, thank you for coming.
Thank you, David.
This is David Dubal, and thank you for listening.
For the Love of Music, with today's host, David Dubal, WNCN Music Director. We hope you'll be with us when once again we meet to listen and exchange ideas, all for the love of music. For the Love of Music is produced by WNCN New York, GAF Broadcasting Company.